those citizens of the world who cannot stand up for themselves, end quote. This quote from United States Representative Joseph Crowley summarizes my reason for affirming this resolution, that we cannot leave people to suffer and die in the midst of international wars. Because of this, I affirm the resolution that the United States has a moral obligation to mitigate international conflicts. For clarity in today's debate round, I provide the following definitions. United States, the government of the United States of America. Moral obligation, something that you ought to do because it is morally right. Mitigate, a reduction in the harmful effects of something. International conflicts, prolonged controversies or quarrels involving two or more nations. That leads me to a point of resolutional analysis, which you can tag as affirmative must prove moral principle. Again, affirmative must prove moral principle. All moral obligations exist as moral principles, and we need to judge based on whether or not that moral principle exists. Now, there are two factors that are true of moral principles. Subpoint A is of hierarchy. Now, there are some moral obligations that are higher than others. As the United States government, our highest obligation is to our people, but that doesn't absolve us of lower obligations like protecting people in other countries. For instance, we as people have a moral obligation to tell the truth and a moral obligation to save life, but those two can come into conflict, like having to lie in order to save a person's life. But that doesn't mean I don't have a moral obligation to tell the truth. It was simply trumped at one moment in time by a higher moral obligation of protecting life. The obligation still exists regardless of being trumped by a higher moral obligation. Subpoint B is of moral intent. Moral intent. Moral principles always have a good motive. We always aim to lessen the harm of a conflict when mitigating. Now, there may be instances where the results of our mitigation may not fully achieve our good intentions. However, we should not judge based on such exceptions alone, but rather on the general principle. For example, if because of my sense of moral obligation, I donate cans of food to the hungry, but one of those cans of food ends up being expired and gets a person sick, this doesn't mean that I am wrong to try to help the hungry. It simply means that I should continue to help the hungry, but learn from the mistakes of my past. Now, the value that I believe should be the goal of our government in regards to this resolution is that of human rights. Again, human rights. The term human rights encompasses the rights to life, liberty, and property. It is my belief that these rights are of the utmost importance to protect for United States citizens and for the peoples of all nations. To show what I must prove in this debate, I provide the following observation. Observation can tag as two kinds of moral obligations. Two kinds of moral obligations. According to the John Bouvier Law Dictionary, there are two kinds of moral obligations. First, those founded on protecting a human right, and secondly, those founded on the fulfillment of a promise. These are two binding moral obligations that we, as people and as government, are bound to fulfill. Proving that mitigation fulfills either of these proves the resolution true, therefore warranting an affirmative ballot. I'll be showing how we are actually morally obligated to mitigate through both of these standards. Mitigating international conflicts protects rights and fulfills promises. I'll expand on these concepts in the following three general arguments or contentions. Contention 1. Mitigation protects rights. Mitigation protects rights. Mitigation is a moral obligation because it seeks to protect human rights. The intent of mitigation is always to better a situation, and without that intent, it cannot be called mitigation. American mitigation is the best tool for protecting human rights on a global scale. For an application of American mitigation protecting rights, just look at the conflicts between Egypt and Israel. Up until 1979, Egypt and Israel were in a constant state of war with one another. However, in 1979, Jimmy Carter set up a peace treaty between the two nations, and that peace has lasted ever since. That action of American mitigation saved potentially thousands of innocent lives from being lost in future wars. Clearly, we see that mitigation is morally obligatory as it protects human rights. Contention 2. Mitigation fulfills promises. Mitigation fulfills promises. Mitigation is a moral obligation because of our promises to other countries. We currently have treaties with other countries which bind us to mitigate international conflicts. Take, for instance, the United Nations Charter. We are a party to this treaty, therefore we are bound to fulfill it. America is one of the 5 permanent members on the United Nations Security Council, which means we have a specific responsibility to mitigate international conflicts. The Los Angeles Times said on March 4, 2014, quote, "The members of the Security Council, and especially the 5 permanent members, have an obligation to use their power as it was intended, so that people might live in peace, security, and dignity," end quote. Through the United Nations, we've been called upon to mitigate in many international conflicts, such as the Korean War, where we protected the Republic of Korea against armed aggression from North Korea. Mitigation fulfills promises, and therefore mitigation is morally obligatory. Contention 3 can tag as unwarranted inaction is immoral. Unwarranted inaction is immoral. If we do not mitigate, we do two things. Firstly, we allow suffering to continue. Allowing suffering to continue when we have the means to assist is a moral atrocity in itself. Consider the Rwandan genocide. Not only did the United States refuse to mitigate the conflict, but also spurred many other nations not to mitigate as well. The blood of 800,000 innocent Rwandans is on our hands. Inaction jeopardizes lives and is thus unwise. Secondly, we also hurt our own people. By ignoring treaties we've made, we lose global influence. This emboldens our enemies and can lead to serious threats on our national security. We must keep our influence in order to protect our people, and the best way to do that is to fulfill our commitments as a country. Now, through this case, I've shown that there are two kinds of moral obligations, protecting rights and fulfilling policies. And I've also shown you how mitigation fulfills both of these standards. Because of this, I believe that the resolution has been significantly affirmed, and I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Well, Levy, I'm going to start out with a question first off about moral obligations. Would you agree that a moral obligation is right to uphold?
Yes, it's really correct.
Okay, good. And it's wrong not to uphold a moral obligation, correct?
Yeah, unless it's a problem with the hierarchy, because sometimes there are higher obligations. Like I said, protecting our people is our highest obligation. If we're protecting our people instead of mitigating, then it's all right. But it's still a moral obligation nonetheless, so the resolution is still correct.
Oh, okay. So, thank you. I completely agree with that. All right. Are you capable of getting out of a moral obligation?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Can it at one point be a moral obligation and then you can be justified in it not being a moral obligation at a later time?
Well, in the case of mitigation, it's always a moral obligation. Yes, it's sometimes trumped by higher moral obligations, or sometimes decisions to not act can also be forms of mitigation as well.
Oh, okay, so not acting can be mitigating a conflict?
Yes, if our actions would actually make the conflict more severe, that is actually an act of mitigation by not getting involved in the conflict directly.
Okay, so do you believe that mitigation is an action?
Yes, and choosing not to act is an action.
Okay, thank you. Is mitigation always good?
Mitigation always good. Yes, sometimes it can cause, or attempts at mitigation per se can cause bad results, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the intent of mitigation.
So basically you're saying we have a moral obligation to be successful?
No, we have a moral obligation to try to be successful.
Oh.
Having a moral obligation to be successful wouldn't make no sense at all.
All right, so you're saying you have to prove a moral obligation to intend to mitigate conflict?
A moral obligation meaning that we have to, or basically we have to try to make things better.
Okay, thank you. Now, your value that of human rights. You're saying that you have to prove a moral obligation to mitigate conflict based on if mitigation of international conflict protects human rights?
Yes, that's our primary goal, is protection of human rights.
Oh, okay, so what if mitigation in a general instance were to harm human rights? Would you still have a moral obligation?
We still have a moral obligation to try. Again, some instances, or we've tried to mitigate, it does go south. But that, again, we can go back to my idea of the moral intent. Sometimes when we try to give cans of food to the homeless, it ends up being expiring, gets a person sick. But that does not neglect the fact that we have a moral obligation in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Is it bad to hurt people?
I'd say so.
Would you say it's immoral to hurt people?
Well, it depends on the circumstance. I mean, and sometimes in circumstances of mitigation, we do end up hurting people in the process, but that does not deny the fact that mitigation itself is moral.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Another country and choose not to act. We want to believe that real life problems can be solved like they are in action movies. We run in, punch the bad guys, and leave. But real life is complicated and the resolution is false. I'm going to start by presenting my own case and then moving into addressing my opponent's case. First off, with a resolutional analysis, that of blanket statement. Blanket statement. The affirmative must prove the resolution true. No exceptions. Because the resolution is making a moral statement, it wouldn't make sense to say that we sometimes have a moral obligation to mitigate conflict, and sometimes we don't. The affirmative must also prove that the moral obligation of international conflict is more than just an action that's morally praiseworthy, but morally obligatory. An action that must be carried out because it's wrong not to carry out. Now, the 12 words in the resolution offer no quantifiers. It doesn't say some international conflict or the specific international conflict. It just says international conflict. A few exceptions are fine, but for an affirmative ballot to be warranted, she must prove that for the majority majority of the time, we must get involved in international conflict. I will accept my opponent's value that is human rights, so we're weighing whether or not we have a moral obligation based on how successful we are at protecting human rights. In theory, it sounds good to try to save lives by attempting to mitigate international conflict, but the reality is much more complex. This is a huge responsibility to prove a blanket statement like our resolution, and in reality, the mitigation of international conflict is too complex, too easy to get entangled, too easy to get sucked in, and too easy to harm life. And that brings me to my first contention, that mitigation fails. Application, general mitigation. According to the International Journal of Peace Studies, there are quite low prospects for the successful settlement of disputes, especially between intense, enduring conflicts. Some models predict less than 33, 16, or even 8% chance of mediation. If, in reality, we fail the majority of the time we try to mitigate international conflict, we can't have a moral obligation. Remember, in reality, the affirmative must prove true the blanket statement about the vast majority of international conflict. In the past, also, we've had a record of failure. Application, Vietnam. It was a noble crusade to stop the spread of communism. The United States was simply going on a defense mission, protect the people of South Vietnam against the aggressive communist North. One historian noted that Vietnam came to be like a tar baby. The more the United States tried to free itself, the more entangled we became. For one, it wasn't a clear-cut conflict between nations. Even though we were supposedly fighting for the South Vietnamese, we found ourselves resisting South Vietnamese pro-communist guerrillas. They were disguised as civilians, and our troops wouldn't be able to tell the difference until they began firing on us. The total number of military casualties on this unsuccessful mission was 1.5 million. Application 2, Somalia. It also seems so simple. The United States would provide humanitarian aid and save a starving population, but our troops were slowly drawn into power struggles, and this unintended involvement cost lives. Not only did we fail in providing relief, but U.S. attempted mitigation caused the conflict to escalate, and according to the Public Broadcasting Service, Somalia today remains in complete chaos. Contention 2, mitigation is a choice. Mitigation is a choice. We can still get involved in international conflict, but because America is a global superpower, we can choose to get involved in some international conflict. A moral obligation is unrealistic, so the resolution is false, but choosing to get involved is almost necessary. We can use discretion and select a few conflicts to mitigate if it will obviously advance our interests, save lives, or fulfill a promise. In fact, I believe that that's what the United States does this very day. Moving on to addressing my opponent's case. I'm going to start out by addressing the resolutional analysis that the affirmative must prove moral principles. I agree with the first point under this, that of hierarchy of moral obligations, but the second point I have a response to. She said that moral intent, we must have a good motive, and that proves a moral obligation. I have a couple responses. First, that we must look at the real world. We must look at the consequences. Remember, we're weighing whether or not we have a moral obligation based on human rights. So we have to weigh whether or not we have a moral obligation to mitigate conflicts based on how successful we are at protecting life. So looking at the consequences of our actions, not just the intent of our actions. We must look at the real world and the real world consequences to our mitigation, because in the end, it shows that mitigation harms human rights, and that proves the resolution false. My second response is that we cannot have a moral obligation to hurt. If I can successfully prove that mitigation harms the majority of the time, that would show that there's no moral obligation, because we cannot have a moral obligation to hurt innocent lives and hurt human rights. I have a couple responses against her first contention that mitigation protects rights. My response is that mitigation harms. Look at the applications that I brought up in my case, that of Vietnam and Somalia, and also the statistic that we have a 16% chance of being successful. If we're only successful in 16% of the time, it shows that there's no moral obligation because we harm human rights the majority of the time. And my response to her application of Camp David is that it's outweighed. It's outweighed by the numerous times we have failed in mitigating international conflict. There are multiple negative applications that prove this, not just the statistic, that we are only successful 16% of the time. Responding to her second contention, that mitigation fulfills a promise, my response is that we can get out, and that shows it's not a moral obligation. The United States has legal authority to withdraw from the United Nations, but my opponent said in cross-examination that moral obligations are always right, and we always must uphold these moral obligations. If we can legally get out of the United Nations, it shows that it's not a moral obligation. But my second response to the United Nations is that it is binding us to do immoral actions. It has bound us to mitigate international conflicts which fail and harm human rights. I have evidence here saying that overall UN intervention has proved ineffective and inhibiting, delaying the lessening of the severity of conflict. The United Nations isn't successful in mitigating conflicts. It ends up harming rights through multiple applications across the globe. And responding to my opponent's third contention, that unwarranted inaction is immoral. My response is that it is immoral to harm. If the United States is only successful 16% of the time, there's no moral obligation, because that would show that she has to prove a moral obligation to be unsuccessful in the majority of our mitigation attempts. Thank you. And I now stand open for cross-examinations.
So just one question at the beginning here. Why do two best friends have to debate each other?
I don't know.
Very annoying. Yes. All right, so getting into some questions on your case. First of all, is morality absolute?
Moral obligations are absolute, yes.
So just basically always be morally right.
In order to uphold something that, could you rephrase that, please?
Basically, our intent always has to be right, correct?
The intent, and we also have to look at the outcome of moral obligations as well, to determine whether or not we can have a moral obligation.
Right, so can we tell the future?
No.
All right, so how do you suggest we prove a moral obligation, or how can I prove that to you?
You have to show that we are successful in protecting human rights.
Every single, is the time?
No, at least a majority of the time. And I mentioned that in my resolutional analysis, that at least a majority, a blanket statement, but not an absolute every single instance.
Gotcha. All right, so going down to your contention 1, subpoint A, brought up some statistics of general mitigation. What were the exact numbers on that?
I said that the article stated that we have a 16, 33, or even 8% chance of mediating international conflict.
And what were the factors involved in those statistics?
There were statistics about conflicts between two or more nations, and also intergroup conflicts, or conflicts that had been going on for a long series of time. There were multiple different graphs.
Which one deals with the intergroup conflicts? Just curious.
I'm not exactly sure. If you want the entire article, I can give it to you.
All right, so that statistic, is it dealing with all types of mitigation or just a specific type?
I'm not exactly sure either. I think it's
Going down, first addressing the negative case and specific arguments that you talk about under there, then going up to address the arguments against my own case. So starting off with your resolutional analysis, talking about a likely statement, I would actually agree to this. And yes, we always have a moral obligation to mitigate international conflicts. I'll be showing this further as we go down the flow. Go down to the value, we both agree this is human rights and this is our goal for this round. We're both trying to uphold human rights here. Go down to our contention 1, she talked about how mitigation fails. I'll spend a lot of time on this contention. Starting off first with the first application of general mitigation statistics. I have two arguments against this. First is that the article is about diplomacy. Again, an article about diplomacy. Interestingly enough, this is something we share in Touche quite a bit. This is a nice little statistic to prove, but unfortunately it's all about diplomacy, not other types of mitigation. My case deals somewhat with diplomacy, but it also deals with other types of mitigation like boots on the ground and various other forms of mitigation as well. Secondly, the stats are about international conflicts, not, there are certain stats about international conflicts, not international conflicts. These are not a part of the resolution. I believe those are the 8% statistics we're talking about, specifically international conflicts, not international conflicts. Let's go down to our application in Vietnam. Now, she again talked about Vietnam as a very terrible failure. I would actually agree, Vietnam was a failure. It was a strategy failure. It was a strategy we used in mitigation that went wrong, not mitigation itself. We had a very good intent at the beginning to try to help people. Yes, it did go wrong, and that is very unfortunate. But we learn from the mistakes of our past, as I talked about in my first speech. We must learn from the mistakes of our past. If we just look at the one failure and decide never to mitigate again, where are we going? We're going to have a terrible foreign policy. Let's go down to her second application of Somalia. You can actually cross-apply my argument here. This is another strategy failure. We're learning from the mistakes of our past and bettering our forms of mitigation. It's not the fault of mitigation that goes bad. The intent is always good. It's always the intent to help people. We're looking at the moral obligation to that, not the specific failures in the certain strategy we use. Let's go down to our second contention, that mitigation is a choice. But I'd like to point you back to my definition of a moral obligation, which is something that we ought to do because it is morally right. Again, look at the word ought. This is something, yes, we absolutely should do it. And it can be very immoral not to. I would agree that leaving people to suffer in other countries is absolutely immoral. But the fact is, mitigation is an obligation, is something we ought to do. Let's go up and look to the affirmative case arguments. Going against my resolutional analysis, subpoint D of moral intent, you have two arguments. First is that we must look at the real world, and secondly, that we don't have a moral obligation to hurt. I'd like to group these together and respond to two arguments of my own. First of all, this is a good discussion for a different resolution. Again, good discussion for a different resolution. If we want to discuss the actual strategy and effects of mitigation, that'd be a good discussion for a different resolution, but the resolution we're debating today is whether or not there's a moral obligation to try to help people. And I believe that is definitely proving that we ought to go out and help people. We can discuss the strategy at a different time. Let's look at the actual intent behind mitigation. My second argument is that of no crystal ball. No crystal ball. Now the resolution is in present tense, which means we have to decide right now if a conflict were to arise, do we have the moral obligation to mitigate that? We don't know the effects that are going to happen because of our mitigation. So we need to decide, do we have a moral obligation right now? I believe the only way to do that is to decide whether or not we have a moral obligation to try to go and help people. It's the only way this resolution actually makes sense. Let's go down to look at her the first contention. She went against my first contention, saying again that mitigation harms and it's outweighed by the other statistics. I've already addressed the statistics arguments and talking about how we're looking at the intent, so you can cross-apply my arguments down to this contention. Let's look at her arguments against her second contention of mitigation fulfills promises. She said that we can get out of the United Nations, basically saying this isn't a consistent moral obligation. I have two arguments against this. First is that the moral obligation is not specific to the United Nations. Again, moral obligation is not specific to the United Nations. It applies to every treaty. Yes, we can back out of treaties, but we have a moral obligation right now. That's what we're looking at right now. Secondly, the obligation is through the United Nations right now. So, and I'm out of time, but you can cross-apply the arguments I've already made to contention 3. Thank you.
Let's say, for instance, that there is a doctor, and you would say that that doctor has a moral obligation to save lives. It's his job, and that's what he was trained to do. But let's say, for instance, that there's a different doctor who is employed as a doctor, but got his doctor credentials, his degree in an unqualified way. So he's working as a doctor, but he doesn't actually have the credentials to be a doctor, and he doesn't know quite how to successfully treat patients and save lives. And we see that this doctor fails numerous times when he tries to save lives. Now, this doctor does not have a moral obligation because he does not know how to do it, and because he fails the majority of the time. He doesn't have a moral obligation to try to help people because he is unsuccessful and actually turns out harming people most of the time. Now, this is applied to our resolution today, when the affirmative must prove that the United States has a moral obligation to mitigate conflict. Now, let's say that the United States is kind of like the doctor in the analogy that I brought up. She must prove that the doctor is a qualified doctor that's successful in mitigating international conflict. But my stance today is that the doctor that we are talking about, the actor in this resolution in the United States, unfortunately has a terrible track record of mitigating international conflicts. The United States is an unqualified doctor, if you want to put it into those terms. So I'll be cross-applying this argument as I go down the flow. First, looking at the resolutional analysis that my opponent brought up in her affirmative case. We've been talking about mitigation and how we're looking at either the consequences or the intent of mitigation. And my opponent said that we can't tell the future. We have to prove a moral obligation in the present tense. But my response is that we cannot have a moral obligation to harm. If the United States fails in mitigation in the majority of the time, just like that unqualified doctor, there's no moral obligation to do something that has failed the majority of the time in the past. We must look at the consequences of our past actions in order to determine whether or not we have a moral obligation in the future. This is real world. We have to learn from our mistakes. And if we fail the majority of the time, we cannot be morally bound to mitigate international conflict. Looking at my opponent's first contention, that of mitigation protects rights, I responded by saying that mitigation harms. And she said that the statistics that I brought up were actually specifically looking at diplomacy. So even if these statistics were specifically looking at diplomacy, I'm going to have a few other negative applications that show that mitigation does fail the majority of the time. For instance, the applications of Vietnam and Somalia that I brought up. Also, look at the example of Burma and also El Salvador. These were instances where we thought we had a moral obligation to mitigate international conflict, and we aided the governments in those instances, and they ended up freeing up the government to harm their people, to abuse human rights. It shows that there is no moral obligation to harm. Responding to my opponent's second contention, I responded to the application of the United Nations by saying that we can get out, and also we are bound. This is showing that we are bound to do something immoral because the United Nations has actually failed in the majority of instances. My opponent responded by saying that the moral obligation isn't specific to the United Nations. There are other organizations. But my response to this is all of these are still promises binding us legally, but we can legally get out of these, showing that these are not moral obligations, because a moral obligation must stand on its own. It must be right in and of itself, and we can get out of these instances and show that we don't actually have a moral obligation to mitigate because of the promise that we have made. And also, my opponent didn't respond to the fact that the United Nations has failed in a majority of instances. There are lists of where the United Nations has abused human rights, and we were bound because of our promise. My opponent said it's a moral obligation to harm. Moving into my opponent's response against my case. She agreed with my resolutional analysis that mitigation is a blanket statement. Responding to my first contention, she responded to the application that of general mitigation by saying that this was an article specifically about diplomacy. But again, let me cross-apply the other applications that I brought up earlier, that mitigation does harm in the majority of the time. Whether or not that article is focusing on diplomacy, it still shows that mitigation harms. Also, a quote from that same article, it's from the International Journal of Peace Studies. It says, these models that they have made, quote, it is also, alas, a reminder of how little we know about conflict termination and conflict management. It shows that the United States is an unqualified doctor. We fail when we mitigate international conflict and cannot be bound to do so in a majority of instances. She responded to my applications of Vietnam and Somalia by saying that these were both strategy failures, but the intent was good. And again, my response is that, well, if we fail, we have strategy failures the vast majority of the time, it proves there's no moral obligation. It shows that when we fail, when we try to mitigate, when we have the intent of mitigating, we harm human rights, which is the highest standard in today's debate now. We can't have a moral obligation to harm people. We can't be bound to mitigate international conflicts when we harm human rights the majority of the time. My opponent responded to my second contention by saying, looking at the definition of moral obligations and saying that moral obligations are right and they must be upheld. And that's exactly my point. She has to prove that it is immoral not to mitigate international conflict. But that means she has to prove that it is moral to mitigate conflict in the majority of instances, and we see that it has been immoral because we have failed in the majority of instances. But when we look back to my second contention, it shows that if we are not bound to mitigate conflicts, if we have a choice, and well, we're not bound to mitigate them in the majority of the time, but we can choose if this one's going to advance our interests, or we can choose if this one looks like it's going to be successful, then we're not bound to harm human rights. But we can actually benefit ourselves if there's no moral obligation, if we can choose and determine whether or not we need to get involved, but not be bound to. So that leads me to a couple of voting issues which will determine a negative ballot at the end of today's debate round. First, that mitigation harms. I mentioned this several times, that mitigation harms human rights and there's no moral obligation. And so my final voting issue is that there is no moral obligation. At the end of the day, the moral obligation to mitigate international conflict does not stand. Thank you.
We are the best doctor out there. Now, the interesting thing about doctors is that doctors swear by the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm to their patients. They do their best to help people, but sometimes a person can't be helped, or the surgery is unsuccessful. However, if, for instance, a surgeon isn't able to succeed, they aren't absolved of their duty to try to treat patients. If America fails to lessen the severity of a conflict, that wouldn't absolve them of the moral obligation to mitigate international conflicts. Now, what I'll be doing in this final speech of the round is going down bringing up three key voting issues that I believe certainly warrant an affirmative ballot. Starting off with my first voting issue, that of a moral obligation to try. A moral obligation to try. Now, in order to earn a negative ballot, the negative must prove to you that the intent behind mitigation is bad. Because determining what moral obligation to the intent is the only way this resolution actually makes sense. We can't have a moral obligation to the end, because we don't have a crystal ball. We have no way of determining that. We don't have an obligation to the specific action that we use, since that is very consequential and doesn't even make sense for determining morality. So we only have the moral obligation to the and try to mitigate. That is the only way this resolution can actually work. So we must be looking at the moral obligation to try to mitigate international conflicts, to try to do and make things better. This obligation is something that we ought to do per the definitions. Now, it is something that we ought to do. We ought to try to help other people. We ought to fulfill our promises. This is a very simple, logical line. We ought to try to help people. Now, yes, there are certain circumstances where mitigation does go wrong, but it is a learning process. We must learn from the mistakes of our past. Yes, there are terrible examples of bad mitigation sometimes, but that does not absolve us of our moral obligation to at least try. Now, for instance, we just take a look at one bad example of mitigation and decide never to try to mitigate again. What type of foreign policy would that be? It is an absolutely terrible measure of mistake for obligation. Let's go down to my second voting issue, that of mitigation fulfills promises. Mitigation fulfills promises. Now, she reiterated her argument about the United Nations. We can get out of being part of the United Nations Charter, essentially. But that has actually no impact on this, because it is a moral obligation to fulfill our promises. Now, mitigation fulfills our promises embedded in the United Nations Charter, as well as many other mutual defense treaties. Yes, these treaties can be canceled, but that doesn't impact the fact that we have a moral obligation to mitigate. Again, this resolution is in present tense. We have a moral obligation to mitigate right now through the United Nations Charter and through other mutual defense treaties. My third and final voting issue is that mitigation protects rights. Mitigation protects rights. Now, she brought her statistic talking about how diplomatic mitigation does fail. But as I have already shown, that doesn't have any impact on this front, because we are also talking about other types of mitigation. But also, she came back and talked about how there's examples of bad mitigation, but there's countless other applications of good mitigation. For instance, Biafra, Bosnia, Ivory Coast, Grenada, Kuwait, Mozambique, Namibia, and many, many others. All of these show that mitigation indeed does protect rights. Thank you, and I urge affirmative.